Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war news update. First part of the 8th of April 2025. We're going to start where we normally start, the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, and you can find them linked in the description to the video below. Pretty quiet night. This is in danger of being one of my shorter videos. I often say that and then waffle on about something, but really is quiet across the skies at night at the moment in Ukraine. We've had almost a week now, I think, of some of the lowest um, drone stats that we've seen for a very long time. But we'll get to that in a second. I'm feeling a little bit jaded today, exceptionally late night last night, quite a bit of red wine. And so, excuse me if I stumble over words. Uh, so we will start with the personnel stats: 1,290 Russian personnel lost, according to Ukrainian General Staff. That is typically high, right? But not as high as we have seen it. It's below the 1,300 threshold that I often talk about. 5 tanks, that's about half the daily average. 14 troop carrying AFVs, that's below the daily average. And then we get on to 43 artillery systems. That's a pretty good number, double the daily average, give or take. So consistently high in that category at the moment. There's definitely something going on with the Ukrainians trying to explicitly degrade the Russian artillery capability and capacity. We've got 3 multiple launch rocket systems. That's good. That's a good haul in that category. And 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems, likewise decent there. Those are high value, usually, but not always, high value targets, especially if they are something like an S300 or S400, although we haven't seen anything like that for some time. Then we have 107 vehicles and fuel tanks. Again, typically pretty high there, and 2 pieces of special equipment. So a fairly decent day at the office for the Ukrainians, not as high as we have seen over the last week, I guess. Um, Andrew Perpetua has been providing us with his loss list from surveying these socials over the last, again, week or so, with a few days, not off here and there because he never has days off, but he struggles to get the lists out sometimes. And today is one of those days. He says here, I remember back when we had 185 videos in one day and freaked out because we could barely do them all working together as a team. Never thought back then I could do 258 videos by myself in one day. And then he says there were 318 videos today. So, he and his team have so much content to trawl through every day, work out whether they're duplications, work out whether they are drone videos being shot from different directions. Something the Russians very often do is they claim they've blown up something, and then maybe a month later you'll see that same claim but filmed from a different direction. And they'll make that duplicate claim. So people like Perpetua and his team, he will have ways of working out whether there are duplications or not. It's not just issues like that. It's just simply working out what some of this equipment is and who uh, who it belongs to. Sometimes you're going to know if it's a particular unit releasing footage, although not all the time. There can be some shady antics going on there, but a particular unit will release a montage and okay, that's a Russian unit. We know that this stuff's going to be Ukrainian. But sometimes when you're looking at satellite imagery, or videos of someone driving past destroyed equipment, if that's an area that has been under the control of both sides, and both sides are using Soviet era kit, then it can be really difficult to work out, well, actually, whose blown up husk of a vehicle is that? Was it a Ukrainian vehicle that the Russians did as they're coming through, or was it a Russian vehicle that Ukrainians hit before the Russians came? So on and so forth. So these things can be really, really difficult endeavors. Right. So no loss list there from him, but we have a few bits of footage. Really, Very little stuff coming out over the last 24 hours. Ukrainian Air Force, though, has carried out 3 airstrikes on buildings in Goptarivka, Kursk, where Russian troops have concentrated. At the end of the video, I think you can see them picking through rubble to look for survivors and whatnot. So, you know that there were troop concentrations there. Just mentioning this because we are seeing, like I keep mentioning actually, we are seeing quite a few instances of the Ukrainians using guided glide bombs, airstrikes. This is interesting because it's in the Kursk region, so you are able to get Ukrainian jets close enough to drop their guided glide bombs safely enough, one presumes. Uh, I would have thought that they've done a good job of degrading the Russian air defenses in these areas in order to then give kind of close air support or strike at strategic or important tactical targets in the area. So we are seeing, I think, it's very difficult to say because you don't know whether they're just releasing more footage but carrying out the same amounts of airstrikes. But I just do get the feeling that with the Mirages and the F-16s that have come along, that we are seeing more guided glide bombs, and maybe just with also a bigger inventory of guided glide bombs. The French are producing more and providing more of their AASM Hammer guided glide bombs, and of course we've got the American sort of JDAMs and GBU 69s and 32s and all this kind of stuff. So I think they probably do have more stuff. So here is Noel Reports talking about that video. Um, yeah, skillfully carrying out 3 airstrikes. Russian troops are concentrated. At the end of the video, you can see them clearly trying to clear the rubble. So you can go and check that out at your leisure by looking at the links in the description to the video below. But that's really, I don't have too much else at the moment in terms of video footage of equipment and strikes. No Russia on fire, no partisan activity that I'm aware of. So we'll move already onto the distant strikes and a really quiet night for the for the Ukrainians in terms of what the Russians have sent into Ukrainian airspace. 40 out of the 46 drones were taken out, 9 shot down. So conventional warfare responsible for only 9 of the 46, 31 taken out by electronic warfare. It's good to see that proportion going up to levels that are pretty significant. Been worried about the ease with which some of these Russian drones can get through now, and I think they are more resistant to electronic warfare. Uh, but it could be skewed by just a small number, and of course, we have yet again a number that is maybe a quarter of what we were seeing a few weeks ago. So this last week, I think yet it. I said this yesterday. I think you've either got a situation where the ceasefire negotiations are having an effect on um, the Russian numbers here. I don't think that's the most probable explanation. I think the Ukrainians must have hit a Shahid factory or depot because my mantra: you would if you could, you aren't, so you can't. The Russians would hit with as much stuff as they possibly could every single night if they could. So if they aren't doing that, there's some issue. And if I was in charge of the Ukrainians, as you know, I would have put the Shahid manufacturing facilities. We think there's maybe 3 of them now around Russia. I would have put them and the depots for Shahids as the number one target for me because they're, you know, firing 200 of these. Into Ukraine every night and then starting to get an improved resilience to electronic warfare means that you were getting 20 through to hit their targets on a nightly basis or to cause havoc in cities. That's every night that was cumulatively counting, and that's now really dropped down. We had one night of none at all. Last night 46. Yeah, I'm hoping that that's really good news for the Ukrainians there. Okay, so on to talk about these strikes. There was a few nights ago. There were quite a few missiles sent as well, if you remember. So Zelensky talked about that yesterday, about the night before. So this is kind of 2 nights ago. Zelensky confirmed that Russia fired ballistic missiles at Ukrainian cities from the Black Sea, and he says it proves that Russia doesn't adhere to any partial maritime ceasefire. So you remember there's supposedly a ceasefire on energy infrastructure that's been put in place. I wasn't quite sure whether the maritime ceasefire from the Black Sea was um, something that had been finalized, but the implication here from Zelensky is that yes, it is in place because he's saying that they're not adhering to it. So that's an interesting admission as far as I'm concerned. But also the claim that the Russians have broken it. He says Ukraine accepted Trump's full and unconditional ceasefire, but Putin refuses. And I'm sure they'll be providing as much information if the Americans need it. They'll be collecting most of their information themselves. But we know that Andrei Spihar, the Ukrainian foreign minister, has provided information to the to the Americans in terms of how the Russians have broken the energy infrastructure ceasefire. And here we have potentially evidence that they've broken the maritime ceasefire uh, agreement. And you would hope that the US might actually do something about that. But Trump, as we know, is very, very reluctant to put any pressure on Russia whatsoever because he appears to be, I don't know, more aligned to Russia than to Ukraine. Okay. Satellite images confirm the destruction of a missile warehouse at Russia's Shaikovka airbase. And this is actually going back 8 days or so to the 31st of March. And like I mention quite frequently, we don't always get the details of Ukrainian strikes. So last night, I have no knowledge of any Ukrainian strikes, but I can pretty much guarantee they'll be hitting things, and that Russian OPSEC or the the laws involved in sharing footage of strikes on social media, meaning you get into a lot of trouble. I think they're having quite some effect at the moment. So I don't think we're getting a lot of public um, information concerning Ukrainian strikes into Russia. So what some people, well, what people are obviously doing, they are checking satellite imagery regularly to see if certain key installations or targets have been hit or not. And here's satellite image uh, confirmation showing the destruction of a missile warehouse at Russia's Shaikovka air base. Um, they confirmed the strikes on the warehouse containing KH-22, KH-32 missiles and a technical maintenance facility for servicing these weapons during an attack on the airbase situated about 200 kilometers north of Ukraine. The airbase houses two 22M3 strategic bombers and Russia's 52nd Heavy Bomber Aviation Regiment, which has been involved in lots of missile strikes against Ukrainian territory using those missiles. And it was attacked by unmanned aerial vehicles in the early hours of March 31st. And you can see the evidence of the strikes from the satellite images. You can feel free to check out the link. It will be in the description below, as ever. And you can check out these satellite images at your leisure. As a result of the strike, infrastructure at the airbase was damaged, primarily destroying the facility used for preparing the missiles, where they were fueled and configured before launch, with the channel indicating that the stationary refueling stations disappeared following the attack, according to the satellite imagery. Destroyed supersonic missile warehouses were also identified at the airbase, with one located near an aircraft parking area suffering significant damage, as confirmed by satellite photographs. Um, and yeah, the Militiani website notes it was unable to identify the object located at one of the aircraft parking spots. So visually, it appears there might be an aircraft remains at this location. However, it's also possible it could be the remains of a building. So potentially an aircraft hit, but not altogether sure. So that is, I think, in this yellow square there. Okay, so that's good news for the Ukrainians, but really, very little information, both in terms of what's been struck in Ukraine and what's been struck in Russia, if indeed anything of note has been. Anton Gerashenko points this out, and I think this is absolutely great. Shows the resilience of the Ukrainians here. So this is in Kharkiv. The next day, the day after an attack that severely damaged a croissant bakery, very next day they resumed work despite their boarded windows. The printed letter say, "We are working." I mean, here's Lviv croissants. I've been to Lviv croissants. It's a chain. I do like them actually. It's a great establishment. And here you can see, I presume all these windows have been smashed due to a strike, boarded everything up, and they're like, "Yep, still working. We are still open." And of course, there's a necessity. There's a raw, you know, there will be a desperation to keep the economy ticking over, not from a state point of view, although there is that, of course, but just from a personal point of view. We've got jobs. Um, we need to keep earning the money in order to keep existing. Otherwise, Kharkiv, for example, just capitulates and everyone leaves. You've got to hang on to life in economic life. So that is it's good to see that resilience there. So Ukraine has requested the UN Security Council meeting over recent Kryvyi Rih strike. Sorry, Russian forces struck there with an Iskander M, killing 20 civilians, including 9 children. I'm going to link the UN. In fact, I've got it here. Um, let's go and have a look at it. Yeah, this one. Talaria has sorted out this petition that needs people to share it to make sure it gets some traction and more people signing it for the Russians to be kicked out of the UN, right? Nonetheless, there has been a UN Security Council meeting called by the Ukrainians over the horrific Iskander missile strike on Kryvyi Rih. Okay, moving on to other bits and pieces already. We have a statement from Zelensky, the former commander-in-chief for for the Ukrainian armed forces, who is now ambassador to the UK, talking about Wiesbaden, in place in Germany. In reality, he says no reports. Uh, well, much was said about Wiesbaden. In reality, the secret headquarters became a key asset in planning operations and shaping Ukraine's military needs. Again, according to Zelensky, originally a logistics hub, it evolved into a joint command center with allies, ensuring weapons reached the front. So this is the statement from Zelensky about Wiesbaden. He says, last week much was said about Wiesbaden, and for good reason. This headquarters has truly become our secret weapon in coordinating with partners on operational planning and identifying the necessary resources for implementation. Today, I'd like to share a few behind-the-scenes details about how it came to be. After the onset of Russia's full-scale aggression, military assistance from our international partners grew significantly, and with it came a wide range of weapons and equipment, along with the new logistical challenges, particularly in terms of delivery and maintenance. To address these, we established a coordination center for military aid to Ukraine in April 2022. It was initially based at the headquarters of the United States European Command in Stuttgart, Germany. In time, this work was transferred to Wiesbaden. As the war progressed, we came to understand that we needed more than just a coordination center. We needed a joint operational headquarters with our partners, a hub that could assess the needs for weapons and equipment based on the real-time planning of operations. This became particularly urgent in the summer of 2022 when some partners began to question the necessity of certain types of ammunition for the Ukrainian front. That's when the idea of operations focused logistics hub was born, one that could evaluate planned operations of the armed forces of Ukraine and, following NATO standards, determine the precise support required. With crucial support from the United Kingdom, this concept was brought to life. Wiesbaden gained a new strategic mission. It's quite interesting hearing, and again, I've said this a number of times. Yeah, I'm British, so these kind of things make me go, "Oh, yeah, well on us. Oh, brilliant, aren't we great?" But actually, there are so many little hints I hear that the British are massively involved in a way that perhaps other nations aren't. I know that there are an awful lot of British people in Ukraine, both from kind of like, yeah, International Legion and stuff like that, but like providing security details, special forces, putting things in place. I think we have our fingers in quite a few pies, and I've heard a lot of quite uh, important people high up in certain areas just saying things that um, indicate that the UK really is an important supporter of Ukraine. Anyway, from that point on, Wiesbaden became the nerve center where operations were planned, war games were conducted, and supply needs were identified and communicated to Washington and European capitals. This platform has since evolved into an exceptional mechanism for collaboration with our partners, and one that helps ensure alignment on future military operations and the resources needed to carry them out. So it's a little bit on Wiesbaden there from Zaluzhny. Now, just moving on to this, human rights in Ukraine have released a report on Russia seeking the effective death sentence against, in this case, a 69-year-old Crimean Tatar political prisoner, and horrific sentences against 5 others. Now, the Tatars in Crimea have been, for a long time, oppressed by the Russians, and that's possibly why Turkey, partly, I mean, there are a number of reasons why Turkey is so supportive of Ukraine, at least in the rhetoric they give. Sometimes, yes, they straddle, well, not sometimes, they do straddle both sides of the fence, the Turks. But one of the areas that they are supportive of Ukraine is applied to the Tatars as Muslim um, communities who receive a raw deal from the Russians. So Russia's worst conveyor belt of repression, the article says, in occupied Crimea has sunk to a new low, with 6 recognized Crimean Tatar political prisoners from Jankoy facing sentences of 17 and 17 and a half years. Not only are none of the men accused of any recognizable crime, but even the charges are those virtually copy-pasted from trial to trial since 2015, with the sole difference lying in the huge sentences demanded in this case against all of the men, as well as the fact that Khalil Membetov is already 69, making this a near certain death sentence. And so it goes on to sort of detail these men and the plights they have endured so far and will continue to endure at least for another 17 years by the looks of it, on trumped up charges that amount to nothing, really. But yeah, that is why I think the Atesh partisan group is that originally from Crimea, primarily of Tatar. I know that the Tatars have been heavily involved in partisan activity, I think. Right, so Donald Trump is not happy with the Russian bombing of Ukraine, and he says he doesn't know what's happening there. The U.S. president has expressed frustration with Russia's deadly missile attacks on Ukraine, but is yet to make any concrete action against the Kremlin. And of course, that last point is the key one. Yep, you can say how annoyed you are, but if you refuse to do anything about it, it gets pretty frustrating, doesn't it? Let's hear him and what he says here. If I just refresh this page, do that again, here we go, and turn the sound on.
And I'm not happy about what's going on with the bombing, because they're bombing like crazy right now. They're bombing. I don't know what's happening there. That's not a good situation.
Remember, I tell you, he speaks like a child. And if you do a linguistic assessment of what he says, he only ever speaks in real vague generalities and simplifies everything. Anyway, I don't want to have a big rant about him, but it's just like, this is so typical. But at least he is railing against the bombing of Ukraine and not doing both sidesism here.
I'm not happy about what's going on with the bombing, because they're bombing like crazy right now. They're bombing. I don't know what's happening there. That's not a good situation. So we're meeting with Russia. We're meeting with Ukraine. And we're getting sort of close. But I'm not happy with all the bombing that's going on the last week or so. Horrible. It's a horrible thing. And
so that is good news that he is. I mean, he didn't mention Russia doing that. He said, we're meeting with Russia, we're meeting Ukraine. I'm not happy with the bombing. So I'm not happy with Russia bombing Ukraine. He never says that. I'm not happy with Putin. I'm not happy with. No, he doesn't say any of that. And that's really important, by the way. Do not underestimate the importance of concentrating on the little things and the words that the Americans use. We note from the top right down through the administration and through even, Bridget Brink, the US ambassador the other day, was criticized for this. Just there is no use of causal or moral language looking at, when Russia does anything. There's is no connection that it to Russia really. Like you could be forgiven thinking, wondering who's fighting in this war. Who is it that's attacking Ukraine? I can't remember now because no one seems to mention them. But there's a lot of the bombing going on, and the bombing is terrible. Yeah, it is terrible. I just have no idea who's doing it. But anyway, nonetheless, it is good that he's saying that. Now we need that to be followed up with, and we're going to screw them over in terms of sanctions and whatnot. The US did not impose tariffs on Russia, quote, because we're not doing business, Trump says. This is fascinating because I've told you that the US keep changing the reason as to why they didn't slap tariffs on Russia. They've slapped tariffs on everyone else. Then it's like, oh, it's because we're already doing negotiations with them. Oh, okay, so you don't want to mess up the negotiation. Okay, and then someone else says, oh, it's because we don't do any business with them. Um, uh, which is what Trump says here. This is one of the reasons. And then someone else says, "Oh, it's because of this," and then someone else says, "Oh, because is because of that." It's because they're sanctioned. And actually, well, Iran's sanctioned, and yet you slap 10% on it. Everyone's all over the place. And here, Trump is just throwing his hat in the ring to give one of the excuses, but not reference to any of the other ones. And actually, this isn't the one that people have been saying recently when they've been wheeled out onto, say, Fox News or CNN or whatever. That the more official reason appears to be because we don't want to mess with negotiations, but that's not what Trump said. So the US did not impose tariffs on Russia despite imposing tariffs on over 180 different countries and territories because, quote, we're not doing business, Trump said yesterday with them. And of course, and by the way, the main point, I guess, here is that's incorrect. Like you are, what was it, $3.5 billion worth of business of imports from Russia. So you are doing business with Russia, and you can put tariffs on them. So, I mean, therefore his excuse is also evidently it is incorrect. Like it's obviously incorrect. So, yeah. Pentagon's considering withdrawing up to 10,000 US troops from Eastern Europe. According to NBC, the US is considering a proposal to reduce troop levels in Poland and Romania as Trump seeks a ceasefire with Putin. If the move is made, it could signal a US retreat from Europe. This is something we talked about previously. Just wondering what's going on to some degree here because we have heard there's hearing today, I think, that they want to spend $1 trillion on defense. And then we heard again recently that Hegseth is trying to save 8% a year from the DoD budget, but that doesn't make sense of what's going on. Then he's talking about actually they need to get rid of 90,000 troops. This is a highly controversial claim that's going to run up against the idea that, well, China's increasing the size of their all aspects of their armed forces. Russia's doing what Russia are doing, and the US appears to be cutting active troops by 90,000 and moving troops out of Europe, then just receding from positions of power and reducing their capacity. But then at the same time saying, no, we're not, we're going to spend $1 trillion. So it's all over the shop as far as I'm concerned. Now, the Estonian parliament has planned to give defense forces a right to use military force against merchant ships if they are suspected of attempting to damage the undersea cables or other critical infrastructure. This is significant. So military will have the right to sink a suspicious vessel that does not obey their orders. And that's the Estonian parliament planning on doing that. So, of course, that's not yet the case. And it's very different. These are different things saying, yeah, we have the ability, we've got the right to sink a ship that's doing that, and then actually making that decision, doing it, because that could be seen by whatever nation controls that ship, i.e., probably Russia, as an act of war, and then you're in a lot of a different situation than you were like 5 hours before. And more on the oil situation. Goldman Sachs is revising its oil price forecast due to tariffs, according to the Bell. In the crisis scenario, $40 is on the horizon. If the global GDP begins to fall, so with the tariff trade war, we're hearing that China is now going to be hitting uh, the US, not just in terms of reciprocal tariffs and tit for tat tariffs, or even strategic tariffs in certain other areas. Actually, they're going to start doing things like making the US apply for licenses to be able to get hold of rare earth metals. Is it something like 12 rare earth metals that US cannot provide for themselves. And this is partly why Elon Musk has now gone against the Trump administration, which is interesting, in saying that the tariffs are a bad thing because, of course, his businesses, SpaceX and Tesla, are going to be absolutely hammered if they can't get their resources from China, and indeed, I would argue Russia, but certainly China. In the way that they are able to, at the moment, they're able to operate in China with impunity to some degree. I think there are lots of strings attached, but they're the only Western business that can operate like that. So there's a lot of hold, therefore, over Tesla and Elon Musk, and China hold those cards, and they are going to start pressing buttons on the US that will be very unwelcome for the US and could affect them in terms of national security. I was watching a video this morning where they're saying, yeah, they might have some stockpiles. The US would have been sensible to stockpile a lot of these, you know, rare earth minerals and metals that you probably many of us won't even have heard the names of, but they're incredibly important for like night vision goggles and batteries and all sorts. And if China can say, well, actually, no, you're not having them, then the Trump administration are in a bit of a bind because they want to be flexing all over the shop with regard to, everything on everyone around the world. But actually, if the world works together against the US, it, there could be an awful lot of leverage put back on the US, and it really could come and bite them on the arse. Um, but yeah, if global GDP begins to fall, but OPEC Plus does not succumb to the temptation to lift production restrictions, then oil will cost $54 per barrel by December, and then $45 by the end of 2026. And if OPEC Plus also lifts restrictions, then by the end of 2026, the market will see oil below $40. If that is the case, I know 2026 might seem a long way away, but if you're moving down consistently down towards that point, I mean that is an amount of money per barrel that the Russians just cannot sustain. That is making oil at a loss and selling it at a loss, and that's one of the main funding streams for the prosecution of this war. Is hugely important. This so one of the few bright silver linings to a very dark cloud in terms of the economic war is the price of oil going down. That's one of the things that will hurt the Russians the most. Anyway, that's enough for me. Really appreciate your support. Sorry, my microphone was so low yesterday. It's all, I don't know, settings going haywire without me doing anything. So there seems to be randomness on this computer. So apologies for that yesterday. Hopefully this is a little bit louder. Appreciate your support. Take care. And I'll speak to you soon. I'll try and get another video done today, but I'm not sure whether that will happen. In the meantime, take care. Speak soon.